Picture the North Atlantic in the spring of 1945. A convoy escort locks onto a German submarine with sonar. The crew rolls depth charges off the stern. Massive columns of white water shoot into the air. The ocean shakes. Every man on the bridge holds his breath. And then, nothing. The submarine is still there. They attack again and again. Over the course of hours, escorts hammer that submarine with hundreds of depth charges. The explosions are deafening. The sea churns into foam. Surely nothing could survive this, but the submarine does survive. The boat in question was a Type 7C, and over the course of that single month, it endured what some sources estimate was 678 depth charges. It was never sunk by any of them. It surrendered only when Germany itself gave up. This was not unusual. For most of the Second World War, the standard anti-submarine weapon, the depth charge, missed roughly 9 times out of 10. The men who dropped them believed they were doing something. The thunderous explosions looked impressive, but the submarines kept slipping away. Meanwhile, on the other side of Britain's war, a small team of inventors had already designed something better, a weapon so effective that 1 in every 5 attacks ended in a kill. A weapon that sank 47 U-boats by the war's end. A weapon that German submarine captains simply could not understand. This is the story of the depth charge Hedgehog weapon, the anti-submarine weapons of World War II, and the engineer who nearly gave up trying to save lives that the old way of fighting could not. To understand why depth charges failed, you need to understand a simple problem of geometry. In 1939, the Royal Navy entered the war confident that its underwater detection system, called ASDIC, had made the submarine obsolete. ASDIC, the British name for what Americans called sonar, sent a pulse of sound through the water. If the pulse struck a submerged object, it bounced back, telling the operator the bearing and range of the target. There was just one problem. ASDIC could not look straight down. As the attacking ship closed in on a submarine, the sound beam swept ahead and to the sides. But directly beneath the hull, there was a dead zone. And here's where the geometry became deadly. Depth charges were stored at the back of the ship. They were rolled off racks at the stern or thrown to the sides by launchers. This meant the escort had to pass directly over the submarine before it could drop its weapons. But the moment the ship passed over the target, the submarine vanished from the ASDIC screen. The operator lost contact at roughly 300 yards. At that instant, the submarine commander knew exactly what was coming, and he had precious seconds to change course and depth. The escort was firing blind. The depth charges had to sink to a preset depth before they exploded. If the depth setting was wrong, they detonated above or below the submarine, doing nothing. Even when the setting was right, a depth charge had to explode within about 20 feet of a submarine's hull to cause serious damage. 20 feet in a dark ocean, against a moving target that had just gone invisible. The odds were terrible. And it got worse. When the depth charges finally detonated, the underwater explosions churned the water into a wall of turbulence. This turbulence blinded the ASD completely. The operator could not regain contact for minutes. During that time, the submarine commander could turn in any direction, change his depth, and slip away. The escort would have to start the search all over again. So here's the key. The Royal Navy had a detection system that lost contact at the worst possible moment, paired with a weapon that could only be dropped after that contact was lost. The escort was always attacking where the submarine used to be, not where it was. Early in the war, only about 5% of depth charge attacks resulted in a kill. That number would improve somewhat with better tactics, but the fundamental problem remained. In the entire war, the Royal Navy recorded roughly 5,174 depth charge attacks. These produced only about 86 kills. That is a ratio of about 60 to 1. 60 attacks to sink 1 submarine, and during every one of those failed attacks, merchant ships were being torpedoed. Now let us go back to 1940, to a cluttered office inside the British Admiralty. A Canadian-born chemist named Charles Goodeve had a job that sounded like it belonged in a novel. He ran a department called the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. The staff called it by its nickname, the Weezers and Dodgers. It was a small, scrappy team of scientists, engineers, and naval officers tasked with inventing unconventional weapons. Among its members was a man better known by his pen name, Neville Shute, the novelist. Goodeve and his team understood the depth charge problem. They could see it in the numbers. The geometry of the stern attack was fundamentally broken. No amount of training or bravery could fix it. What was needed was a weapon that could be fired forward over the bow while the submarine was still visible on the ASDIC screen. Now watch what happens. The concept was not entirely new. An earlier attempt called the Fairley mortar had tried to throw depth charges ahead of the ship. It was tested secretly aboard a destroyer in 1941. It failed. The device was too heavy, too clumsy, and could not land its charges accurately. But the principle, firing forward instead of backward, was sound, and Goody's team found a way to make it work, thanks to a connection that seems almost accidental. A retired Indian Army officer named Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker had spent years developing a peculiar invention called a spigot mortar. This was a barrelless launcher. Instead of a tube that contained the projectile, it used a steel rod, the spigot, to ignite a propellant charge and fling a bomb into the air. Blacker had originally designed it as a cheap anti-tank weapon for the Home Guard. The War Office had largely ignored him until a dramatic demonstration caught Winston Churchill's attention. When Blacker's spigot mortar design was shown to the Weezers and Dodgers, Goody saw something the Army had missed. The spigot principle could be scaled up, mounted on a ship's foredeck, and used to throw a pattern of small bombs ahead of an attacking vessel. The team got to work, but turning this idea into a weapon that actually worked required solving several hard problems. The contact fuse had to survive the violent impact with the sea surface without detonating, yet explode instantly when it struck the steel hull of a submarine. The shape of each projectile had to be designed so it entered the water cleanly and sank straight down, not tumbling off at an angle. The pattern of the 24 projectiles had to be wide enough to catch a maneuvering submarine, yet tight enough that multiple bombs would strike the hull, and the amount of explosive in each small bomb had to be enough to punch through a submarine's pressure hull, even though each projectile weighed only 65 pounds, far less than a standard depth charge. The team solved these problems one by one. Each projectile carried 35 pounds of Torpex, a powerful explosive blend. They were fitted with contact fuses and arranged on a launcher with rows of spigots angled so that all 24 projectiles would land in a circular pattern roughly 130 feet across. About 200 yards ahead of the ship, they sank 3 times faster than a depth charge. When the launcher was loaded, its rows of steel spigots bristled upward like the spines of a small animal. Someone looked at it and said the obvious thing. They called it the Hedgehog. In May of 1941, the Hedgehog was installed on the foredeck of a veteran destroyer called the Westcott. A test firing was conducted in Liverpool Bay against a known wreck on the seabed. The results were extremely successful. The weapon entered production, but here's a twist that nobody expected. The crews did not want it. The Hedgehog reached the fleet in 1942. It was fitted to over 100 escort ships by the end of that year, and yet, in its first months of service, the weapon achieved almost nothing. The initial success rate was only about 5%, barely better than depth charges. What went wrong? The answer was not the weapon, it was the men. Depth charges, for all their flaws, had one powerful advantage: they always exploded. When an escort dropped a pattern of depth charges, the crew heard and felt enormous blasts. Water erupted. The ship shook. Even if the submarine escaped, the crew felt like they were fighting. The explosions were reassuring. Officers could report that they had made an attack, and the noise seemed to confirm that something had been achieved. The Hedgehog worked differently. If the 24 projectiles missed the submarine, they sank silently to the bottom. No explosion, no geyser, nothing. The crew stared at the empty sea and felt like they had accomplished nothing. A Hedgehog miss was deeply discouraging. Captains quietly stopped using the weapon. They preferred the dramatic thunder of depth charges, even though the math proved those charges were failing. The Royal Navy launched the Hedgehog so rarely in early 1943 that the Admiralty had to issue a formal directive. Captains were ordered to report in writing why they had not used the Hedgehog on an underwater contact. The problem was not just psychology. North Atlantic weather was brutal. Salt spray soaked the launcher on the open foredeck. Seawater fouled the electrical firing circuits, causing misfires. Projectiles failed to launch, leaving gaps in the pattern. There were no proper manuals. Training was thin. The weapon that could have been saving lives was gathering rust on the foredecks of escort ships. So here's the problem. The Navy had the right weapon, but the wrong habits. And changing habits during a war, while men are dying, is one of the hardest things any institution can do. It took one determined act to break the deadlock. An officer from the Weasers and Dodgers was sent to the escort base at Londonderry in Northern Ireland, where the convoy crews were stationed between crossings. He brought better maintenance procedures, clearer instructions, and, most importantly, real examples of successful Hedgehog attacks. He gave ship-wide talks. He showed the crews the math. The math was simple. A depth charge had to land within 20 feet of a submarine to kill it. The Hedgehog did not need to guess the depth at all. Its contact fuses meant the projectiles only detonated when they struck something solid. If even one or two hit the hull, the submarine was doomed. Let us zoom out for a moment and see why. A single Hedgehog bomb punched a hole roughly 3 to 4 inches wide in a submarine's pressure hull. At a depth of 250 feet, seawater would pour through that small hole at roughly 400 gallons per minute. This flooding was unstoppable. The atmospheric pressure inside the boat would climb. The temperature would soar. The submarine would lose depth control and sink deeper, which increased the flooding. Within minutes, the crew would be dead, and the boat would keep falling until the hull collapsed. One hit, that is all it took. And if the Hedgehog missed, the water stayed calm. The ASDIC kept working. The escort could simply come around and try again, without losing contact. After the training at Londonderry, the kill rate began to climb. By the end of the war, 1 in every 5 Hedgehog attacks resulted in a confirmed kill. Compare that to depth charges, where the ratio was roughly 1 in 60. The Hedgehog was more than 10 times as effective. Now let us see what happened when trained crews put the Hedgehog to work. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest campaign of the Second World War. It began on the first day of the conflict in September 1939 and continued until the last day in May 1945. German U-boats, operating in coordinated groups called wolf packs, hunted Allied merchant convoys carrying food, fuel, and weapons across the ocean. Winston Churchill later wrote that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. By March of 1943, the crisis had reached its peak. U-boats sank over 500,000 tons of Allied shipping in that single month. The convoy system itself seemed to be failing. The British Admiralty privately acknowledged that the Germans had never come so close to severing the link between the New World and the Old. But then the tide turned, and it turned fast. In May of 1943, the Allies sank 41 U-boats. It was a catastrophe for the German submarine fleet. Admiral Karl Donitz, the commander of the U-boat force, withdrew most of his submarines from the North Atlantic on May 24th. The U-boats never regained the advantage. No single weapon or technology won the Battle of the Atlantic alone. The victory came from a combination of better radar, longer-range aircraft, cracked German codes, more escort ships, and improved tactics. But the Hedgehog was a critical piece of that puzzle. It gave escort captains something they had never had before, a weapon that let them attack while they could still see the target. The numbers tell the story. Over the full course of the war, the Hedgehog was used in 268 attacks. These produced 47 confirmed kills. That ratio, roughly 5.7 attacks per kill, was revolutionary. And the weapon proved itself not only in the Atlantic. In May of 1944, in the Pacific, a small American destroyer escort named England demonstrated what the Hedgehog could do in the hands of a well-trained crew. The England was a modest ship, a Buckley-class escort weighing only 1,400 tons. But she carried a Hedgehog launcher, and her crew had trained obsessively. Acting on intelligence from American codebreakers, the England and 2 sister ships were sent to intercept a line of Japanese submarines forming a scouting barrier in the waters near the Admiralty Islands. On May 19th, England detected the large Japanese submarine I-16 with her sonar. The first Hedgehog attack missed. The second scored a single hit, but the big submarine survived and kept maneuvering. The third attack missed. The fourth missed. On the 5th run, 4 to 6 projectiles struck the hull. A massive underwater explosion lifted England's stern clear of the water and knocked men off their feet. I-16 went down with all hands. Over the next 12 days, England sank 5 more Japanese submarines, one after another, using her Hedgehog. 6 submarines in 12 days. It remains the greatest anti-submarine achievement by a single ship in naval history. The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest King, sent a message that has become legendary in the United States Navy. And notice what happened during those engagements. The other American escorts also made Hedgehog attacks. They missed repeatedly. But the England's crew, drilled to precision, scored again and again. The weapon worked, but it demanded skill. Now let us go beneath the surface. German U-boat crews were intimately familiar with depth charges. The experience of a depth charge attack was terrifying. The crew could hear the escort's propellers overhead. Then came the clicks as the charges armed, followed by shattering explosions that buckled plates, shattered light bulbs, and flung men across the compartment. Paint flaked off the hull. Pipes burst. The entire boat groaned under the pressure. But depth charges gave the submarine crew something important: information. They could hear the attack coming. They could count the explosions. They could judge by the intervals and the intensity whether the escort was close or far, whether the pattern was ahead or behind. Experienced commanders used this information to maneuver. They turned hard during the blind period. They changed depth. They played dead and waited for the escort to lose patience. The Hedgehog offered no such warning. The projectiles entered the water silently, at high speed, sinking 3 times faster than a depth charge. There was no click, no distant rumble, no chance to count and calculate. The crew of a targeted submarine heard nothing at all, right up to the moment the hull was punctured, or they heard nothing because the attack missed and the escort came around silently for another pass. Captured German submariners and post-war testimony reveal a consistent pattern. U-boat crews who survived encounters with Hedgehog-equipped escorts often did not understand what had happened. They knew something had changed in the way the British and Americans were attacking. The patterns were different. The timing was wrong. Some reported hearing small, sharp explosions that did not match the familiar deep rumble of depth charges. Others said their boats were struck without any warning at all. The Hedgehog took away the one advantage that a submarine commander had during a depth charge attack: time. With depth charges, the submarine had the entire blind period, sometimes 30 seconds or more, to maneuver. With the Hedgehog, the attack arrived while the escort was still tracking the boat on ASDIC. There was no blind period, there was no warning. There was simply a sudden, catastrophic hole in the pressure hull, and then the ocean pouring in. It is worth noting that no submarine is known to have survived a direct Hedgehog hit. The weapon was either a clean miss or a kill. There was almost nothing in between. Let us go back to where we began. An escort ship in the North Atlantic, depth charges crashing into the sea, enormous explosions, the whole dramatic spectacle of war at its loudest. It looked powerful. It sounded powerful. But the submarines kept escaping because the weapon was aimed at the wrong place at the wrong time. The Hedgehog did not solve the U-boat problem with more explosive power. Each of its 24 projectiles carried only 35 pounds of torpex, a fraction of the explosive in a standard depth charge. The weapon that changed anti-submarine warfare in the Second World War was not bigger. It was not louder. It simply fired forward instead of backward, and it exploded only when it struck its target. The problem was never firepower. The problem was geometry, and the solution came not from the admirals or the fleet commanders, but from a small team of scientists and engineers, the Weasers and Dodgers, working in cluttered offices, fighting institutional resistance at every turn, led by a Canadian chemist who at one point had to arrange a personal demonstration for the Prime Minister just to keep his own Navy from killing the project. The weapon they built sank 47 U-boats in the Atlantic and devastated Japanese submarine lines in the Pacific. It gave escort captains the ability to attack without going blind. It turned the math of anti-submarine warfare from 60 to 1 down to less than 6 to 1, and the German submarine captains who faced it never fully understood what was killing them. They trained for depth charges. They knew how to survive explosions. They did not know how to survive a weapon that made no sound at all until it had already punched through the hull. The anti-submarine weapons of World War II evolved from brute force to precision. The depth charge Hedgehog weapon was the first step in that evolution, and it remains one of the most important. The weapon that helped win the Battle of the Atlantic was not the most powerful device ever dropped into the sea. It was the smartest.